Okay, ready for this? Today we're diving into something that might sound kind of dry at first. API governance.
Yeah, it does sound a little technical, doesn't it?
It does, but trust me on this, it gets really interesting. Especially if you've ever used, well, software.
Which is pretty much everyone these days, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And with so many companies relying on APIs now, it's not just about, keeping things organized. It's about whether a company can actually keep up and stay competitive.
It's true. And that's actually a perfect lead-in to what we're diving into today.
And that's where Nauman Ali comes in.
Right.
He's a product manager over at Stoplight. They're all about API design and governance platforms.
And he gave this talk recently that really broke it all down in a clear way.
He did, yeah. He talked about how to manage APIs at scale, which is so important for bigger companies.
Especially for them. Think about it. Hundreds, thousands even, of APIs, all needing to, work together.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. And Nauman actually used a really relatable example, I think. He said it's like that junk drawer everyone has.
We all have one. Don't even try to deny it.
Exactly. But imagine if that drawer, it held the keys to how your whole business runs.
Oh, that's a scary thought.
Right. And just like if your drawer is a mess, you can't find anything, a company can totally lose track of its APIs.
He actually calls it API sprawl. Right?
He does, yeah. API sprawl. And it can be a huge problem for companies. Wasted resources, duplicated work, just a lot of headaches for developers.
So where do you even begin with something like that? It seems overwhelming, to be honest.
It is a big task, no doubt. And Nauman really emphasizes starting with something simple but crucial, an API catalog.
Okay, so for people who aren't familiar, what exactly is that?
It's not just another developer portal.
Okay, good to know.
Think of it more as a master inventory of all the APIs a company has.
So it tells you what you have, where it is, what it does, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just the big important APIs either. It's about getting everything in one place.
Even the little ones, huh?
Especially the little ones. You'd be surprised how quickly they can get out of control. So before you can even think about governing those APIs...
You have to actually know what you're dealing with.
Exactly. It's like trying to, plan a road trip without ever looking at a map. You're just going to get lost.
That's a good analogy.
And just like a map helps you navigate, an API catalog helps developers find the resources they need, reuse existing code, avoid creating duplicates. It's all about efficiency.
And I bet that internal clarity saves a lot of headaches down the line, right?
You have no idea. Countless hours and so much frustration avoided.
Okay, so it sounds like a simple solution in theory, but actually really powerful when you think about the impact it can have on how a company runs.
Totally.
So you've got your map, you know what APIs you're working with. What's next?
Well, now that you know where you're going, it's time to, figure out the rules of the road. And for Nauman, that means emphasizing consistency in API design.
Instead of every single API being written in its own way, it's more like creating a universal language for your software to communicate.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's got to make everyone's lives easier.
100%. And it makes those APIs much easier to use, maintain, and it cuts down on errors significantly.
Which are all good things.
The best things. Imagine if everyone's using totally different naming conventions or structuring data in their own way.
It would be chaos.
Total chaos. And a nightmare for anyone trying to make sense of it all.
So how do you get everyone on the same page? Is it like a giant rule book or something?
That's where it gets really cool, actually. Nauman talks about making the desired way of doing things the easiest way. And he loves using automated style guides for that.
Okay, now you're talking. So like a grammar checker, but for code.
Exactly. Instead of handing developers this huge PDF of rules, you build those rules directly into the tools they use every day.
So it's like catching errors in real time, like a spell checker.
Exactly. It's all about gently nudging developers toward best practices without, punishing them for making mistakes.
That sounds way more effective than trying to memorize some giant rule book.
Right. And it makes sure everyone's on the same page without slowing down that development process.
So give me an example. What kinds of things would you standardize?
Oh, it could be something as simple as naming conventions. Instead of having these endless debates about whether to use usered or userid, the style guide just sets the standards.
It's decided.
Done. And that not only makes the code cleaner and easier to read, but it also ensures that everyone understands what that piece of code represents.
Right. And if everyone's on board, there's no confusion.
Exactly. And it's not just about, like, aesthetics either. Style guides can also enforce best practices for documentation, which, let me tell you,
Which is essential. We've all been there, right? Trying to decipher something with zero documentation.
the worst. Staring at lines of code like it's written in a foreign language.
Yeah, I'm getting flashbacks.
Right. So style guides can actually help prevent that by, for instance, requiring developers to include descriptions for all of their API endpoints.
So you always know what you're looking at.
Exactly. It's all about making life easier for everyone involved.
It's like having the instructions when you're trying to put together furniture from IKEA. Having those instructions makes all the difference.
Right. So much easier. And speaking of making things easier, Nauman's next point is all about reusable components in API design.
Okay, now we're talking. Everyone loves a good efficiency hack. Tell me more.
So it's all about working smarter, not harder.
Right. Always a good strategy.
Think of it like building with Legos. You've got your set of pre-built components like walls, windows, doors. You don't have to start from scratch every time. Reusable components for APIs work kind of the same way.
I love that. So instead of each team having to reinvent the wheel every time they need to use a common function,
They can just grab a pre-built component that already works.
and that's already been tested and everything.
Exactly. Let's say you need to handle user authentication for your API, instead of everyone building their own system from the ground up.
Which would be a nightmare.
The worst. You provide them with a pre-built authentication component that already incorporates, all the latest security best practices.
That makes sense. So not only are you saving time and effort, you're also ensuring consistency.
Exactly. And let's not forget about reducing errors. Fewer errors mean happier developers, happier users, everyone wins.
It's a no-brainer. So we've got our catalog, our style guide to keep things consistent, and now reusable components to make things more efficient. But at some point, we have to talk about governance. How do you actually ensure all of this stuff happens?
Right. We need to make sure it's not just a nice idea, it's actually implemented.
Yep.
So that's where a structured but collaborative review process comes in. Nauman's a big believer in this. He talks about building this culture of feedback around API design.
So what does that actually look like? Give me an example.
Okay, so before an API is released out into the world, it goes through a review process.
Sort of like submitting a paper for peer review.
Exactly. Other developers can provide feedback, make sure it meets the company's standards, that everything's working together the way it should. And those automated style guides we talked about, they're super helpful here.
So you're catching those inconsistencies early on.
Exactly. And that frees up the reviewers to focus on, the bigger picture.
Making sure the API actually makes sense and fulfills its purpose.
Yes. Is it user-friendly? Is the documentation clear? Are there any potential problems we haven't thought of?
So it's not just about following the rules. It's about making sure the API is actually solving the problem it's supposed to solve.
100%. And here's another cool thing Nauman mentioned, something called visual diffs.
Okay, I have to admit, I'm not familiar with that term. What are visual diffs?
They're a lifesaver for developers. Imagine, instead of having to compare lines of code, like side by side, you have this tool that shows you exactly what's changed.
So you see the changes instantly without having to search for them.
Exactly. And some tools even go a step further. They can detect breaking changes automatically.
Breaking changes. Oh, that sounds bad.
It can be. Basically, a breaking change is an update to the API that could cause something else to stop working correctly.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly. Not something you want to deal with.
Definitely not. So these visual diffs, the breaking change detection, they're kind of like safety nets.
You got it. It's all about transparency and communication, which, at the end of the day,
Are crucial for any kind of collaboration, really.
exactly.
It's amazing how many different factors go into, creating and managing APIs effectively.
It really is. And it might seem kind of overwhelming at first, all these different elements.
It does.
Yeah.
So where do you even start? If a company's listening to this and they're like, okay, we need to get our act together, where do they begin?
That's where Nauman's final point comes in, and it's a really important one. He emphasized that API governance. It's not about, finding this perfect end state. It's more of a journey.
It's not a destination. It's about the journey.
Exactly. And it's about fostering this culture of continuous improvement, always looking for ways to make things better.
I like that. So you don't need to have all the answers figured out on day one. It's more about taking that first step and then building from there.
Exactly. You don't have to boil the ocean, right?
No need for that.
Start small, Get that API catalog in place, even if it's just a basic list at first.
I got to start somewhere.
You do. And then you gradually add more, sophisticated tools and processes as your needs change and grow. What works for a small startup might not work for a huge company, and that's fine.
It's all about adapting and figuring out what makes sense for your situation, not just trying to copy some, idealized system.
Right. And remember, this whole journey, it's not just about the tech stuff.
It's about the people, too.
Exactly. It's about fostering better communication and collaboration across teams, because even the best tools and processes...
They're useless if people aren't talking to each other.
Exactly. It's about creating this shared understanding of how APIs work, why they matter, and how everyone can contribute to, creating a more efficient and effective API ecosystem for the whole company.
I love that. And that's a great note to end on, I think. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Catalogs, style guides, reusable components, review processes.
It's a lot.
It is. But hopefully our listeners are walking away from this feeling energized, not overwhelmed.
That's the goal. Okay, maybe API governance isn't the most glamorous topic, but...
It's crucial.
Absolutely. It can truly make or break a company's success in today's world.
So for our listeners out there, think about your own work, whether you're a developer or on a totally different team. Where are the biggest communication breakdowns happening? Could better API governance be part of the solution?
It's definitely something to consider. And on that note...
We'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of API governance. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time for another fascinating conversation.